My sister framed me for her divorce and ruined my life. Years later, I got proof and made her pay. Hello, read it. My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm 32 years old. For the last 5 years, I have been an orphan, not by death but by choice. Their choice. If you had told me when I was younger that my family would cut me off so brutally, I would have laughed. We weren't perfect, but we were a family. That meant something, right? Blood was supposed to be thicker than water. Family was supposed to stand by you no matter what. I believed that lie for 27 years. Then, in a single night, they proved to me that I was nothing more than a convenience. Something that only mattered as long as I played my assigned role in their carefully curated lives. The moment I no longer fit, I was erased without hesitation. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. My family was obsessed with appearances, the kind of people who measured success in status, wealth, and what the neighbors thought of them. My father, Richard, was a man who valued control above all else. A respected businessman, a provider, someone who expected unwavering loyalty, but never gave it in return. My mother, Patricia, was his perfect counterpart, a woman who built her identity on social standing, friendships made over charity luncheons, and ensuring that her life was enviable from the outside. Then there was my sister, Melanie. Melanie was the perfect child, the one who could do no wrong. Beautiful, charming, magnetic. She had a way of making people love her, of pulling them into her orbit and keeping them there. She was the golden daughter, the one my mother adored, the one my father respected. Me? I was tolerated. Never neglected, never mistreated outright, but always second. I learned young that the best way to survive in my family was to stay in my lane, to meet expectations, to avoid making waves. I thought that as long as I did that, I'd be safe. I was wrong. Melanie married Daniel when she was 24. He was everything my parents wanted in a son-in-law, successful, charming, from a good family. A lawyer, no less. Their engagement was a spectacle, their wedding an even bigger one. My mother was in her element, parading her daughter's perfect match, drinking in the admiration of friends and relatives. From the outside, Melanie and Daniel had everything. A beautiful home, extravagant vacations, expensive gifts, the picture-perfect marriage. But even early on, I sensed something off. Daniel never looked at Melanie the way a man in love should look at his wife. There was something detached about him, something that felt rehearsed. I never said anything, it wasn't my business, but I noticed. Then, for years into their marriage, it fell apart. At first, no one knew why. Melanie was back at our parents' house overnight, her wedding ring gone, her eyes red from crying. She played the devastated wife so well that no one questioned it. My mother coddled her, my father seethed in quiet rage, and the entire family turned against Daniel without hesitation. It was obvious. He must have cheated, he must have betrayed her, because what other reason could there be? But then I started hearing whispers. I heard the accusations before they reached me directly. It started as background noise, murmurs from relatives, sideways glances at family gatherings. Then my mother called me, her voice sharp and cold. How could you do this to your own sister? I had no idea what she was talking about. When I demanded to know what was going on, I was met with silence. Hours later, a cousin sent me a cryptic text. Melanie told them everything. What the hell, man? That night, I went to my parents' house, desperate for answers. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that suffocates. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother's expression was one of pure disappointment. And Melanie sat there, silent but victorious, like a queen watching a traitor being dragged to his execution. Then my father spoke. Just one word. Enough. As if my defense didn't matter. As if my innocence was already dismissed. That was the moment I knew I had already been judged. Melanie had told them that I was the reason her marriage ended. That I had planted doubts in Daniel's mind, manipulated him, turned him against her. That I had been jealous of her happiness, envious of her success, and had done everything I could to sabotage her relationship. And they believed her. I tried to fight it. I tried to tell them that it wasn't true. I begged them to think for a second, to just consider how insane this accusation was. But they didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain, and I was convenient. By the end of the night, I was told I was no longer welcome in their house. My father called me a disgrace. My mother, who had once tucked me in at night and kissed my forehead, told me she couldn't bear to look at me. Melanie didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had already won. I spent the next 5 years alone. At first, I tried to reach out. I left messages that went unanswered, calls that were ignored. Relatives who had once been like second parents to me suddenly had no time to talk. Friends of the family, people I had known my entire life, started avoiding me. It was like I had died, except I was still here, watching them go on without me. I tried to move on. I built a life away from them, a career, a home. I surrounded myself with people who actually gave a damn about me. The pain never fully went away, but eventually I adjusted to it. I stopped expecting an apology. I stopped hoping that one day they'd realize what they had done. I accepted that, in their eyes, I was already dead. Then 5 years later, out of nowhere, I got an email. The subject line sent a chill down my spine. The truth about Melanie. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding. My hands trembled as I clicked. Inside, there were messages, screenshots, proof. And as I read them, I felt my world tilt on its axis. Melanie had lied. She had fabricated everything, manipulated everyone. She had cheated on Daniel, and when he left, she needed someone to blame. So she chose me. She had destroyed my life to protect her own. And now, I had the proof to destroy hers. The email sat open on my screen, an ugly, pulsing wound that refused to be ignored. Even as I stared at the words, part of me refused to accept them. My mind kept rejecting what I was seeing, some irrational part still clinging to the belief that there had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. But there wasn't. I scrolled through the attachments, messages, receipts, evidence, all pointing to the same undeniable truth. Melanie had lied. She hadn't been the victim. She had been the villain. The messages spanned months, stretching back to nearly a year before the divorce. Conversations between Melanie and a man named Ryan, some of them casual, some of them intimate, others unmistakably explicit. My stomach twisted as I read them, each line hammering in just how much of a lie my exile had been. Last night was incredible. Wish I could have stayed longer. You know how he is. So oblivious. Always believing whatever I tell him. I can't believe he's actually suspicious now. What an idiot. And then, as the messages continued, they changed. Daniel had found out. At first, the texts were panicked. Melanie desperately trying to smooth things over, weaving excuses, playing damage control. But Daniel wasn't buying it. He wasn't stupid. The evidence had been too much. Then came the last message she had sent to Ryan. It's over. He's leaving. I need to fix this before it destroys my entire life. And that was where I came in, somewhere between the fallout of her own actions and the desperation to salvage her reputation. She had needed an escape, a new villain, someone she could point to and say, this is why it all fell apart. Not me. Him. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to sit back. My hands were clenched in a fist, the muscles in my shoulders so tight they ached. 5 years. 5 years of exile, of being disowned, of losing everything I thought I had. And it had all been for this. For her. For a lie. A bitter, twisted laugh escaped me. It wasn't even funny. None of this was, but something about the sheer audacity of it all sent a rush of disbelief through me. My own sister had framed me, stolen my life, destroyed everything I had built, all because she needed someone else to bear the weight of her own sins. And she had done it effortlessly, because she had known they would believe her. They had never questioned her. Not once. They had taken her word as law and thrown me away without a second thought. No hesitation, no doubt, no room for me to defend myself. That was the part that hurt the most. Even now, after 5 years, some stubborn part of me had still hoped that maybe, deep down, my parents had felt guilty. That maybe they had wondered if they had been too quick to cast me out. But they hadn't. I knew that because I had checked in on them in small ways over the years. Not directly, never reaching out but looking from afar. And they had been fine. Their lives had continued unbothered, unshaken. They had Melanie. That was all that mattered. I forced myself to breathe, steadying the fury bubbling beneath my skin. This wasn't the time for emotions. This was the time for thinking, for strategy, because now I had the truth. The first step was figuring out what to do with it. I wasn't impulsive. If I was going to do this, I had to do it right. Sending the email straight to my parents wouldn't be enough. They were already predisposed to believe whatever narrative Melanie fed them. No, I needed something bigger. I needed something they couldn't ignore, something that would make them question everything they thought they knew. And Melanie, she needed to feel it. I switched tabs, my fingers moving instinctively as I typed her name into social media. Her accounts were private, of course, but that didn't matter. I still had mutual connections, people who had never outright cut ties but had quietly drifted away. It didn't take long to find her. The first thing I saw was a recent post, a picture of her, glowing and perfect, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. Her new husband. I felt my jaw tighten. She had moved on, built an entirely new life. And my parents? They were still right there with her, smiling, happy, doting on their new grandchild. A perfect, untouched existence. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating my next move. I needed to know more. I started digging. It took hours, but by the time I was done, I had everything I needed. Melanie had remarried 2 years ago. Her new husband, Jason, was another picture-perfect match, successful, wealthy, the ideal choice for someone like her. But more importantly, Melanie had never told him the real reason for her divorce. To him, and to everyone else in their world, the story had remained the same. Daniel had changed, had become cold and distant, had left her out of nowhere. She had rewritten history, just like she had rewritten my role in it. My anger sharpened into something colder, more precise. This was how she operated. She didn't just lie. She crafted reality, controlled it, bent it into something that served her. But this time, she had left loose ends. Daniel. I found his profile next. It was sparse, barely updated, but a quick look through the comments on an old post told me everything I needed to know. He had never moved on. I scrolled further, my breath catching as I found a single comment buried deep in a thread. I lost everything because I trusted the wrong person. Never again. That was all he had said. But it was enough. My fingers hovered over the message button, a familiar anxiety creeping in. I hadn't spoken to him in over 5 years. What if he ignored me? What if he thought I was part of the problem? But then I remembered the last message in that email. I should have listened to Ethan. I took a deep breath and started typing. Hey, Daniel. It's been a long time. I think you deserve to know the truth. I read it over once, then hit send before I could second-guess myself. The message was out. The first crack in Melanie's perfect world had been made. And it was only the beginning. The message had been sent, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. There was a strange finality in it, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. For so long, I had been stuck in the aftermath of Melanie's lies, forced to live in the ruins of what she had destroyed. But now, something had shifted. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. This was about reclaiming power. I stared at my screen, watching for any sign that my parents had opened the email. Nothing. No response, no notification, just silence. It didn't surprise me. They had spent 5 years ignoring my existence. It would take more than a single email to break through the fantasy they had built around Melanie. But this time, the truth wasn't something they could simply ignore. A part of me was tempted to call them, to demand a reaction, but I knew better. I had done enough chasing. If they chose to bury their heads in the sand, that was on them. I had played the waiting game for years, and I was done being the one left in the dark. I turned my attention back to my messages. Daniel had seen everything. The screenshots, the messages, the proof of Melanie's betrayal. The weight of it was undeniable. She had lied. She had cheated. She had framed me to cover her tracks. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Finally, a notification appeared. A response from Daniel. There was no message, no explanation, just a location and a time. It took me a second to process it. He wanted to meet. The idea caught me off guard. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since the night he had walked out of my sister's life, and by extension mine. Even back then, he hadn't confronted me. He hadn't asked for my side of the story. He had simply disappeared, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. And yet here he was initiating contact. I didn't hesitate. The bar he chose was an old, dimly lit place tucked away on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place Melanie or my parents would ever be caught dead in. This was a place where people went to escape, to drink in peace, to drown whatever ghosts followed them. When I arrived, I spotted him immediately. He was sitting in the farthest corner, shoulders hunched over a half-empty glass, his face partially shadowed by the low lighting. He looked different than I remembered. Older, but not just in the way time ages a person. He looked worn down, like someone who had carried too much weight for too long. I approached without a word, pulling out the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was an unspoken tension between us, a shared understanding of what had brought us here. Years of damage, years of silence, years of being casualties in Melanie's endless pursuit of self-preservation. He exhaled slowly, swirling the liquid in his glass before finally glancing up at me. There was something unreadable in his expression, something distant, yet entirely focused. Then, as if needing to break the silence, he downed the rest of his drink. Even without words, I could see it in his posture, in the way he carried himself. The knowledge that he had been played, that for years he had believed a lie, that he had been manipulated just as much as I had. There was anger in his eyes, but it wasn't directed at me. It was directed inward, at himself. The conversation started slow, like neither of us knew how to begin unraveling the mess that had been created years ago. But once the first words were spoken, everything poured out. He told me he had suspected something was wrong for years, but he had never had the proof to confirm it. He had pushed down his doubts, forced himself to believe the story Melanie had told him, because it was easier than admitting he had been used. When she had turned the blame onto me, he hadn't questioned it. Not because he truly believed I had done anything, but because he needed to believe her. He needed to justify what was happening. And if that meant making me the villain, then that was the narrative he accepted. Now, though, there was no more room for doubt. The proof was there, black and white, undeniable. There was a bitterness in the way he spoke, an edge to his voice that I hadn't heard before. He had lost years of his life because of her, just as I had. He had been forced to rebuild from the ground up, while she had walked away untouched and scathed, ready to rewrite history in her favor. And that was when the conversation took a turn. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the tension in his posture shifting into something else entirely. There was no hesitation when he said it. He wanted to make her pay, not in the traditional sense, not with petty revenge or some meaningless public spectacle. That wasn't enough. Melanie had spent years weaving her web of lies, manipulating everyone around her, constructing a perfect world where she was always the victim and never the villain. If we were going to do this, we had to be smart. I listened as he laid out the beginnings of a plan, and with every word, my pulse picked up. This wasn't what I had initially envisioned, but it was better. I had been so focused on revealing the truth, on making my parents see what they had done, that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. Melanie's entire life was built on deception. Her relationships, her career, her new marriage. All of it was predicated on the falsehood she had spun over the years. If we wanted to take her down, we couldn't just expose one lie. We had to tear down everything. We had to make sure that when her world collapsed, there was nothing left for her to salvage. We spent hours talking, going over details, picking apart weaknesses in the life she had built. There were so many loose threads, things she had overlooked, things she had never expected to come back to haunt her. She had been careful, but not careful enough. By the time we finally left the bar, the weight in my chest had been replaced with something else entirely. Determination. She had taken everything from me, from both of us. Now, we were going to take everything from her. And the best part? She would never see it coming. The plan wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about taking back control, about making sure Melanie faced the consequences of the destruction she had left in her wake. Walking out of that bar with Daniel, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. For so long, I had been lost in the wreckage of what she had done to me, consumed by the unfairness of it all. But now, Now, I wasn't just reacting. I wasn't just trying to defend myself or prove my innocence. I was taking action. Melanie had spent years weaving her perfect little web, manipulating everyone around her, remaking reality in a way that always kept her at the center as the victim and everyone else as either her adoring supporters or her betrayers. That world was about to crumble. The first target was her husband, Jason. He was the key. If Melanie had done what she always did, if she had rewritten history to erase her past and make herself look innocent, then it meant Jason had no idea who she really was. He had married the illusion, the carefully crafted version of her that she wanted him to see. But that was about to change. Daniel and I spent the next few days piecing everything together. We weren't going to rush this. Melanie was smart, calculated. If we wanted to take her down, we had to be smarter. I started by gathering more information, not just the evidence I had already been sent, but everything I could find about Melanie's life now. It didn't take long to confirm what I suspected. She had erased every trace of Daniel from her story. In every social media post, every interview, every mention of her past, she was the woman who had survived a difficult first marriage, who had been abandoned, but had found the strength to rebuild. It made me sick, not just because of what she had done to me, but because she had done the same thing to Daniel. She had rewritten him into the villain of her story, just like she had rewritten me. And she had gotten away with it, but not for much longer. We found Jason's work email first. It wasn't hard. He was a public figure, a corporate executive with press releases and interviews under his name. His professional accounts were easy to track down, but I knew that wasn't the right way to approach him. Melanie had too much control over the story. If we sent the proof directly, she could twist it, convince him it was some elaborate attack from jealous men who wanted to tear her down. That was how she worked. She preemptively controlled the narrative so that when the truth came out, no one would believe it. So instead, we found another way. Daniel still had contacts, mutual friends, old acquaintances from their past life together. People who had once known him and Melanie as a couple before she burned everything to the ground. A few of them had quietly kept in touch over the years, always hesitant, never fully sure what had really happened. One of them, a former co-worker of Jason's, was exactly what we needed. We fed him the truth carefully, just enough to plant the first seed of doubt. And it worked. Jason had always been the type to value honesty. His entire career was built on his image as a man of integrity, someone who couldn't be bought, someone who wouldn't tolerate deception. He prided himself on being a good judge of character, on seeing people for who they truly were. So when he started hearing whispers that his wife might not be who she claimed to be, he started asking questions. And that was when we sent the files. Not through an anonymous email, not through some untraceable account. We made sure it came from someone he trusted. There was no way for Melanie to twist it, no way for her to immediately go into damage control. Jason saw everything. The screenshots, the conversations, the proof of her affair with Ryan, the way she had thrown Daniel under the bus, the way she had destroyed my life to protect her own. And then, the final blow, a recording. Daniel had found an old voicemail, something Melanie had left him at the height of their divorce, back when she still thought she could control him. In it, she had admitted just enough to confirm everything. She hadn't known it at the time, but that message was about to ruin her. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Jason confronted her. Melanie, of course, denied everything. She called the messages fabricated. She insisted Daniel was a bitter ex-husband trying to poison her new life, that I was a jealous, spiteful brother who had never forgiven her for outshining me. But Jason wasn't Daniel. He wasn't my parents. He didn't blindly believe her. He dug deeper. He checked dates, cross-referenced stories, went looking for his own answers. And the more he looked, the uglier it got. He found out that Melanie had lied about her past, had omitted details about her first marriage, had manipulated people in her career the same way she had manipulated her family. She had built her entire life on deception, and now, piece by piece, that life was falling apart. And I watched it happen. Her world began collapsing in real time. The perfect image she had cultivated started to crack, and once those cracks appeared, they spread fast. Jason wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. He had been deceived, and in his world, reputation mattered. He didn't just want to leave her. He wanted to make sure everyone knew why. The divorce was swift, brutal, and public. Melanie had spent her life ensuring that she was always the beloved one, always the person who came out looking pure, innocent, untouchable. Now, people knew. The whispers started. The questions. The doubt. And my parents? They weren't spared from the fallout either. The moment their perfect daughter's reputation took a hit, they started distancing themselves. At first, they defended her. But when the weight of the evidence became too much, when their friends, their community, the people they had spent years impressing stopped looking at them with admiration and started looking at them with pity, they folded. They turned their backs on her, just like they had turned their backs on me. And I didn't feel bad for them. Melanie had made her choice 5 years ago. She had decided that her survival mattered more than my life, more than Daniel's, more than anything else. Now, for the first time, she was the one standing in the wreckage. And I was free. There was no coming back from this. Melanie had spent her entire life weaving illusions, ensuring that every version of herself presented to the world was flawless, unbreakable. But reality had finally caught up with her. The cracks had been forming for months, but now there was nothing left to hold her world together. Her marriage was over, her reputation was in shambles, and her carefully curated career was collapsing under the weight of its own deception. And the best part? She had no one left to blame but herself. The fraud investigation had started quietly, nothing more than a whisper of doubt among the higher-ups at the company she had worked for. At first, it had been minor discrepancies, numbers that didn't quite add up but could have been written off as simple accounting errors. But once they started looking, once they started pulling records and comparing reports, the full extent of her theft became undeniable. She had taken hundreds of thousands, siphoning money in a way that had kept her undetected for years. If she had never lost control of the narrative, if Jason hadn't left her so publicly, if people hadn't started questioning the stories she told, maybe she would have gotten away with it. But she had made enemies, and enemies looked closer. The moment charges were filed, it was over. She had built her life on perception, on admiration, on being the woman others envied. Now, people only looked at her with disgust. The press got hold of the story, and soon, the name she had spent years perfecting became synonymous with scandal and disgrace. The Melanie my parents had worshipped, the sister who had stolen my life, was gone. In her place stood someone stripped bare, someone who no longer had the power to rewrite the story in her favor. It should have been satisfying, and in some ways it was. I had spent years trapped under the weight of what she had done to me. I had watched as she walked away unscathed while I was left with nothing. Seeing her fall, knowing that the world finally saw her for who she was, should have made me feel victorious. But when I saw her before the trial, when I looked into the face of the woman who had caused me so much pain, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel pity. I just felt nothing. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual polished mask long gone. There was no charm left, no carefully rehearsed expression that could turn the situation to her advantage. For the first time, she wasn't in control. And the worst part for her? She knew it. There was a moment when our eyes met, and for the briefest second, I wondered if she would finally admit it. If she would finally look at me and say, "I'm sorry." But she didn't. She just sat there, silent, as if she knew there were no more words that could save her. I didn't say anything either. I had spent years waiting for this moment, imagining all the things I would say to her if I ever got the chance. But standing there, seeing her like this, I realized there was nothing left to say. She had lost everything, and there was nothing I could do or say that would make it worse. She had done this to herself. So I turned and walked away. Melanie was sentenced to 7 years in prison. There was no appeal, no reduced sentence, no last-minute escape from accountability. She was gone, and no one came to her defense. Not our parents, not Jason, not the people she had once surrounded herself with. In the end, she had burned every bridge, used up every last ounce of goodwill she had, and when she needed someone to fight for her, there was no one left. My parents never reached out to me, not even after they lost her. Maybe they were too ashamed, or maybe they were too stubborn to admit they had chosen the wrong side. Either way, it didn't matter. I had spent years mourning the loss of my family, But the truth was, I had never really lost them. They had never truly been mine to begin with. Their love had always been conditional, their loyalty fleeting. And I didn't need them anymore. For the first time in years, I was free. Not because Melanie had been punished, not because my parents had finally suffered consequences for their choices, but because I had let them go. I had spent so much time waiting for justice, for the moment when I could finally prove I had been right all along. But winning wasn't about proving anything to them. Winning was about walking away. Winning was about moving on. And that's exactly what I did.